It's thank everyone here actually for coming today. It demonstrates just how concerned, I guess, many of us are across the country with regard to this particular issue. And I want to thank Toowoomba for the support, the incredible support that I personally have experienced from this community in the work that I've been doing and the times that I've come here to address the community on the work that I do. So it is a very tough issue, obviously, and one that can be very difficult to talk about and to discuss. Particularly when it comes to Indigenous communities and Indigenous issues, we are not encouraged necessarily to confront the very difficult issues. We don't often want to admit that we have deep problems with a lot of these issues, and I'm sure we all know, particularly within the mainstream media, that a lot of these very difficult issues that the Indigenous community are faced with, that there's a lot of denial and there's a lot of blame placed elsewhere for the issues that we're faced with. So pornography is one of those issues, certainly. It was highlighted during the intervention into the Northern Territory as being a problem, and there are those that I hear from within the Indigenous community who continue to deny that, they feel a sense of shame that it was brought up as an issue that affects our communities. Instead of seeing this issue as an issue of shame, acknowledging that it exists as a problem is the first step toward trying to solve it as a problem. And that, of course, takes place for a lot of the issues we face, domestic violence, child sexual abuse, and all those sorts of things. So the more we can discuss it, the easier it becomes to discuss, if you like, and then to be able to try to solve. So I guess I'd like to begin from where sexuality sits in a cultural context for Aboriginal Australians, and particularly those who still live closer to the traditional way of life, if you like. So in traditional Aboriginal culture, sexuality can be quite a relaxed issue. And it probably had a lot to do with the fact that it wasn't that long ago that my people were walking around with no clothes on in the desert. Everything was there for everybody to see and be exposed to. It's the fact that, you had families sharing shelters together, and obviously mums and dads would continue to have children. They would do things like go and collect firewood together, if you like. But like many societies on earth, where your home environment was quite small, mums and dads would find ways to continue to grow the family, if you like. But there were also very stringent rules. For example, in the top end of Australia, there were, you have avoidance relationships also, but the relationship between, when you got to a certain age, around puberty, your women and men sort of definitely became more separated. For brothers, for the sisters, they would have to walk several metres behind their brothers. Now, some would argue, modern-day feminists would argue that this is a very misogynistic way of looking at the world, but it was about respect. Once you reach a certain age, puberty, and obviously your body started to change. For young men particularly, you had to show utmost respect. You could not become sexually aroused by your sister, clearly, obviously. So it made sense that as a woman, you walked several metres behind your brother. We had avoidance relationships. One of those relationships, I'm told by many who come to learn about it, particularly men from other cultures, is that for men, you completely and utterly avoid your mother-in-law as a sign of utmost respect. There are those who believe this should probably be carried out in other cultures. But you showed utmost respect by total avoidance. And that was one of those relationships, because your mother-in-law ultimately made you a man, because she was the person that gave you your wife, and you were not regarded a man until you had a wife, and then you had children, and ultimately you became an ancestor. So there were very rigid rules also in place around respect for one another. There were, however, because everyone was walking around naked in this environment, quite often there was humour around genitalia, and sometimes this humour was also directed at children. And I've still seen this take place nowadays. It's usually women toward children's genitalia, and I've found it to be, because I was brought up in both ways, that actually, that's probably not the right thing to do anymore, to make fun of a child's genitalia as part of our humour. And I've pointed these things out, and when they've been pointed out, it's not till you actually point that out to family members that that's probably actually not appropriate. And it's probably encouraging some of the sorts of things that we're seeing in terms of, child sexual abuse. But once they're pointed out, once you have those conversations, there's a realisation, a sort of understanding. It dawns on people, well, actually, maybe there's some, maybe that is right. Maybe we shouldn't talk in those ways or behave in those ways anymore. Maybe it's not appropriate. And they're the sorts of conversations that need to continue to take place, and especially around the area of pornography. I know that, having grown up around remote communities, that pornography has been an issue from when I was growing up, certainly, but even more so now, of course, because of the access, the very easy access there is to pornography. If anyone who's got a mobile phone, a device, anything like that has access to it. Children are confronted with things like online games, Minecraft, Roblox, things like that. An innocent child is simply playing a game which is found online, and within those games now, especially games like Roblox, where the users become the developers of games, they are sexualising some of these games, and children are unfortunately coming across these sorts of things by accident. So you've got that, but then of course you've got very easy access regardless. And once a child knows about these sorts of things, they then it may intrigue them to want to go back and look at those things again. I know a woman, her name is Holly Ann Martin, and she runs a program called Safe for Kids. She is a one-woman show, and she does a very, very important job. She recently travelled through 12 remote communities where there was a police sting set up, and they caught well over 50 men who had been accessing child pornography, who had also been grooming children online, and amongst those men, some of them were from remote Indigenous communities. And she feels like she is at times very much up against this issue because it is so prevalent. And at times I know she has said to me that she feels like giving up because she feels, having visited many of those communities and then understanding that there were men in those communities who had just been arrested, who were part of this sting. She's felt as though part of what she's doing hasn't been changing things. But they are only moments, passing moments for her, and she continues on. And I absolutely and utterly appreciate the fact that she does. But there are many problems that she confronts. She's confronted within those communities. And the way in which she's tried to deal with those is to work with schools in some of those communities. Unfortunately, some schools have made it difficult for her to work in those communities. She's come up against schools that do not report when they have come across a child who they understand has experienced sexual abuse of some sort. And the reason she's been given is because the education department has been so slow to act on those reports, and so the schools just give up in the end and choose not to report. So when I report in my findings, in my research about the high rates of sexual abuse in remote communities, we're not even beginning to see what the real figures are, considering that there are those schools that aren't actually reporting. But she's been very concerned. There was one particular community where she had just been in, and not long after that, a 16-year-old had been raped in that community, and an 8-year-old had experienced sexual abuse by 3 10-year-old boys. And this particular school would not allow her in there to do the work that she needed to do in that community. She's recently spoken to a group of 14-year-olds who she would have very frank and open conversations about this issue with the children that she works with, and ask them, how much pornography do you think you watch per week? And these 14-year-olds admitted to watching 2 hours of pornography a week, and that's what they admitted to. So that to me is utterly incredible that 14-year-olds are watching up to 2 hours of pornography a week. So for Aboriginal people, for a lot of people in remote communities where there is a breakdown of culture, where they are living in lives of dysfunction, we also have the initiation process for young men which takes place. And I don't speak about this issue often, particularly publicly, because as an Aboriginal woman, it's an issue that I will probably take up later on in my life, because what I talk about already puts me in the firing line and certainly under threat. But because of the room that I'm speaking to today and the topic, I will talk about this. So young men are taken through initiation and they undergo circumcision. And sometimes the young boys that are taken can be from the age of 11, anywhere between 11 and 18 for this particular process. Now, once upon a time, this process took about 2 years for young men to undergo. So they left physically as boys and returned physically as men. So the transformation took place during that time for these young men. Nowadays, if you can imagine an 11-year-old being taken for 2 weeks, they have to undergo circumcision, sometimes a sub-incision, so it's a further incision to their genital area. I think it's genital mutilation, personally, and I think it's highly traumatic, and it still occurs nowadays, and I don't think it is necessary. But this produces young men, or boys, if they're still boys, if you like, who return from these experiences and they see themselves as authorities. They see themselves as having the authority to treat people as they wish, to treat girls and women as they wish, because they see themselves now as men. So this, having gone through this very traumatic process and then coming out thinking that they are men with all this authority, and coupled with the exposure to pornography, is an absolute recipe for disaster, and is one of the reasons why we're faced with the high rates of sexual abuse and domestic violence within our communities as well. We've got a situation where also young people are viewing pornography and thinking this is normalised behaviour and acting out this behaviour. There's a problem with young people interacting sexually and doing things like the violence, like the choking, acting out those sorts of things. We are dealing with the situations where there are men in communities whose wives will not submit to the sorts of violent behaviours that they view in pornography. So they are then instead forcing young girls, the age of 12 and 13, to submit to this sort of behaviour. And this, of course, is, again, child sexual abuse. The other issue is that quite often, because these conversations don't take place, recently we had the marches for women across the country, and this talk of consent and what that means and what that looks like, and about those sorts of conversations. So my good friend Holly-Ann Martin goes to these communities, and she not only talks to young people, but she talks to the adults in the community. She talks to women and men separately. And she asks the men, do you have conversations around consent? Do you understand that if a woman is passed out, if she's asleep, or even if she says no, do you understand that it's against the law to then have sex with these women? And they say, no, we don't understand that. It's not even something that, that is understood. And unfortunately, in my language, there is no word for rape. In Warlpiri, we have no word for rape. Quite often, in our culture, if a man can have his way with a woman if she is of the right kin category to him, if she belongs to a group that is, that a group of women that he can marry into, then it's not considered rape. It is only considered an offence if that woman is of the wrong kin category. Quite often, in a cultural context, punishment for women for doing the wrong thing was rape. So culturally, there hasn't been a lot of respect for women in that regard. So we are really up against it, if you like. And a lot of these conversations that my friend has with people in communities is often the first time that they have these sorts of conversations. Other conversations include, do they understand that it's actually against the law, that it's child sexual abuse to have pornography playing in a room where children can view it at the same time, where they're in the room as well? And a lot of these adults just, no, we didn't understand that was the case. And, I truly believe that our reluctance to challenge some of our views in Aboriginal communities, to treat Aboriginal people just like everybody else, and not offend Aboriginal people, has actually exacerbated some of these problems. When others besides myself try to speak up about these particular issues and get called racist and shut down, this is the damage that is being done, so that we can't actually address these really important issues that are impacting some of the most marginalised Australians in our communities, and particularly our children. And that was another point that was brought up to me. Well, we're having these marches for women, we're talking about consent, we're talking about sexual harassment in the workplace. What about within our homes? What about within our communities? And who is speaking up for the under 10s? Who is speaking up for these little ones who have been exposed to this horrific sort of behaviour? It seems like there are very little voices out there speaking up for them, but they need a voice even more so than anybody else. So it's concerning that there are schools that aren't willing to report, but also that there are schools in these remote communities that aren't teaching respectful relationships and what that looks like, that aren't teaching sexual education in a respectful manner. A lot of young people are, when asked, why do you watch pornography? And they turn around and say, oh, because we want to learn styles and we want to, learn ways to do it. And because they think it's normal. They think this is normalised behaviour. There are some also young men who would think that, okay, so they're seeing white women behave in these particular ways, then white women must be easy. This is normalised behaviour. And in some cases where there have been attacks on tourists within our community, it's been, you will go back to the basis for it, and the basis has been because of pornography. The vast majority of the time when there is sexual abuse of children in these communities, when there is children sexually abusing other children, it goes back again to pornography and access to pornography. So recently there was a Senate inquiry into age verification online. This is an issue that we all need to stand up and ensure that our federal government understands is utterly important. It is so important for our children that age verification becomes the norm. If that's the least we can do, then that's what needs to be done. I mean, if our federal government can turn around and demand that big tech companies do the right thing, can demand that Facebook pull their head in for the sake of our political leaders being able to voice their opinions on these platforms, well, surely they can do something about age verification when it comes to access to pornography online. Whenever children in communities are asked by my friend, well, where can you get access to pictures of naked people? They say USB sticks. So there's a trade of USB sticks going on in remote communities where if they can't get access out in the community, they're getting access from within places like Alice Springs and then taking it back out to communities, and they're actually paying money for USB sticks. Otherwise, TikTok and YouTube. And they know how to get hold of it like that, within an instant. There was a situation where in a community in Western Australia where a 6-year-old was attempting to get boys to suck his penis in a boys' toilet, and the principal got the families together to discuss that this was the issue, this is what was happening, to deal with the situation. The principal did the right thing in that situation. What happened from there was the family were run out of that school, they were forced out of that community, they moved to another community, and the families of the other boys that had been involved then targeted the next school that this child went to and exposed them online and said this child is a pedophile. And that family had to move from that school again. So my good friend wrote a book on this called Gary Just Didn't Know the Rules. So there has to be, education across the board, not just for children, but for families as well. And I think we have to protect our children because this was a situation that had come about because of pornography. A 6-year-old does not know what they're doing, but they're not a pedophile and they should be afforded every opportunity to understand what's right and what's wrong, to correct that behaviour, and of course without being targeted and without their families being driven out of the community that they're in. As community, we should be coming together to support our children in as many ways as we possibly can. I know that I'll be lobbying our territory government to do more because they simply are not interested when you try to broach these issues with child protection and with the education department. but it is our job, each and every one of us, to do whatever we can in our capacity, whether it's having conversations with our children, whether it's engaging with our school communities, whether it's lobbying our leaders and our politicians to do the right thing. But, you know, for me particularly so within the Indigenous community, particularly where the rates of child sexual abuse are through the roof, where people are not educated as well. Aboriginal people don't have the education, the knowledge and understanding to understand exactly what is going on, what is beneficial for our kids, what is not beneficial for our kids. It's a huge job, but I'm glad to see there's so many in this room who are prepared to do the right thing for our children, for the future, for one another, for our families and for our communities. And thank you very much again for having me here in your community. In fact, I will be back again on the 19th with my Centre for Independent Studies hat on to discuss some other issues. But I look forward to fighting this good fight with you all. Thank you.